the sky over the Effeldorf did not merely darken in the manner of a coming storm, but rather it unravelled with the screaming tear of a reality that had never known the violence of quantum mechanics. There was no prelude to the catastrophe, no gathering of clouds or whisper of warning from the Valar to their faithful, only the sudden and impossible imposition of a foreign physics upon the ancient song of Ada. The fabric of the atmosphere, held in place for millennia by the breath of manhwa, buckled instantly under the weight of a wormhole that obeyed no law of magic known to elf or Maya. It began as a fracture of light, a bruised purple bruise against the grey gloom of Mordor, expanding outward with a centrifugal force that flattened the peaks of the lower mountain ranges and sent shock waves of pure kinetic displacement rolling across the plateau of Gorgoroth. The silence of the Deadlands was replaced by a sonic boom, so profound it cracked the stone foundations of Barad-dûr, causing the great eye to flicker in a moment of genuine, unprecedented blindness. This was not the dissonance of Melkor, which sought to corrupt the theme of creation. This was a noise that ignored the theme entirely, a discordant, metallic intrusion of hard science and cosmic radiation into a world woven from myth. Gravity momentarily inverted within a 50-mile radius of the breach, lifting thousands of orcs, siege engines, and jagged boulders into the air before slamming them back down with the wet crunch of absolute annihilation. The Nazgul, circling high on their fell beasts, were not struck by arrows or sorcery, but by the sheer atmospheric pressure variance of the entry event, their winged mounts' lungs bursting as the air itself turned into a weapon of displacement. They plummeted like stones, their shrieks lost in the roaring vacuum that trailed the object plummeting from the tear in the sky. The object was a vessel, though it resembled nothing crafted by the smiths of Aule or the shipwrights of the Grey Havens. It was a quinjet, a jagged arrowhead of titanium alloy and Stark-Tech polymers, burning with the friction of atmospheric re-entry. It did not glide, it fell, trailing smoke and sparking with dying repulsion thrusters that sputtered uselessly against the magical density of Middle-earth's air. But the vessel was merely the shell for the true disruption. Trailing behind it, tumbling through the rift before it snapped shut with the sound of a breaking god, were figures that radiated power signatures entirely alien to this cosmology. One of them was a green behemoth whose very mass seemed to challenge the earth to hold him, his roar challenging the thunder. Another was a figure of lightning and red cape, a god who was not a Valar, carrying a hammer that hummed with a frequency that made the very atoms of the air vibrate in pain. When the impact came, it occurred in the desolate wastes north of the Black Gate, a collision of worlds that registered on the Richter scale in a universe that had no concept of such measurements. The shockwave stripped the land bare of ash and rock down to the bedrock, creating a crater 3 miles wide in a single heartbeat. In Minas Tirith, miles away, the White Tower swayed, and the bells rang out not in warning, but in sympathetic vibration to the geological trauma. In Rivendell, Elrond grabbed the railing of his balcony, his immortal senses overwhelmed by a sudden, migraine-inducing static, a psychic scream of metal and electricity that drowned out the song of the trees. He felt not a shadow, but a blinding hot light, a presence that was too loud, too fast, and too heavy for the world he knew. Far deeper, in the roots of the world, the nameless things gnawed faster in panic, and in the east, the Dark Lord Sauron turned his gaze from the plans of war to the smoking crater on his doorstep. For the first time in an age, fear touched the heart of the enemy, not because he faced a greater power, but because he faced a power he could not name. The board had been flipped, The pieces were scattered. The War of the Ring had been interrupted not by an army, but by an event that threatened to dissolve the very rules of the game. The Avengers had not arrived as saviors. They had arrived as a celestial impact event, and the dust of their landing was already choking the breath of the world. The smoke from the wreckage of the Quinjet did not rise. It curled low and heavy against the jagged obsidian rocks of the arid Lithui, pressed down by an atmospheric weight that felt less like gravity and more like judgment. Tony Stark awoke to the sound of his own breathing, ragged and amplified by the claustrophobic interior of the Mark 7 armor. But the familiar hum of the arc reactor was terrifyingly syncopated, stuttering like a dying heart. His heads-up display was a chaotic mosaic of red warning glyphs and static, the onboard telemetry screaming about magnetic interference that defied all known charts of the electromagnetic spectrum. He forced a manual release on the faceplate, the servos whining in protest with a sound like grinding bone, and the air that rushed in to meet him was hot, dry, and tasted of old blood and sulfur. He scrambled out of the twisted fuselage, his gold and titanium suit scuffed and dented, boots crunching on shale that was too sharp, too dark. He looked up, expecting the skyline of New York or the curvature of the Earth from orbit, but found instead a sky of bruised velvet, thick with volcanic particulate and devoid of stars. To his left, the Hulk was already pulling himself from a crater of his own making, shaking a head the size of an engine block, his green skin looking grey under the oppressive gloom. The Hulk roared, but the sound didn't carry. The air swallowed it, dampening the sonic energy as if the environment itself was hostile to noise. Steve Rogers was kneeling beside Natasha Romanoff, checking a pulse with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the aftershocks of a dimensional transit that had rattled the super soldier serum in his veins. Clint Barton sat dazed on a fractured rock, clutching his bow, his eyes scanning the horizon with the instinct of a sniper who realizes he has lost the high ground forever. Thor Odinson stood apart from them, Mjolnir gripped tight in his hand, looking not at his teammates, but at the horizon to the south, where a red glow pulsed like an infected wound against the darkness. Stark tried to bring the suit's long-range comms online, but the static was absolute. A wall of white noise that sounded almost like whispering voices. He tapped the helmet, frustration mounting as the sophisticated Stark Industries technology failed to find a single satellite, a single radio wave, a single trace of the digital infrastructure that defined his existence. He turned to Thor, demanding a sitrep, assuming this was some Asgardian backwater, some realm of Yggdrasil that had been left off the maps. Thor turned slowly, his face grave, stripped of the jovial arrogance that usually defined the gods of thunder. He spoke of the air, how it felt thick with a malice he had not felt since the stories of the Dark Elves, but older, more entrenched. He told them they were nowhere found in the archives of Asgard. The physics were wrong. The magic here was not the cosmic energy of the 9 realms, channeled through science and bloodline. It was a pervasive, corrupting song that permeated the soil and the stone. Banner transformed back into human form, shivering violently, not from cold, but from a sudden, inexplicable sickness. He whispered that the other guy was quiet, afraid even. That admission chilled the group more than the alien landscape. The Hulk was never afraid. They took stock of their resources. The Quinjet was scrap, its vibranium weave hull shattered by the impact. Weapons were limited to what they carried. Stark had 60% power, but the suit's repulsors were misfiring. The energy dissipation curves all wrong for this atmosphere. Hawkeye had 30 arrows. Widow had her stingers and glocks, but ammunition was finite. Cap's shield was intact, the only thing that seemed unaffected by the world's heaviness, its vibranium resonance, perhaps the only frequency that this reality couldn't dampen. They were stranded in a box canyon of black rock, with steep cliffs on 3 sides, and a narrow defile leading down towards a vast, ash-choked plain. They had no water, no food, and no intelligence. Rogers took command, his tactical mind trying to impose order on chaos. He ordered a perimeter, a defensive posture, until they could determine local threats. But the threat was not waiting to be determined. It was hunting. The first sound was not a footstep, but a drumbeat. It came from deep within the rock, a rhythmic, guttural pounding that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Doom, doom, doom. Then came the screech, a high-pitched, tearing noise that made their teeth ache. Figures appeared on the ridges above them, silhouetted against the red gloom. They were not Chitauri. They were not Hydra. They were smaller, misshapen, hunched things, clad in jagged rusted iron and black leather, wielding scimitars and jagged spears. Orcs, a scouting party of the Red Eye, drawn by the thunder of the crash. There were 50 of them initially, swarming down the scree slopes with the reckless abandon of creatures who feared their master more than death. Cap shouted the order to engage, hurling his shield. It struck the lead orc, shattering the creature's breastplate and sending it flying. But the shield did not ricochet with its usual kinetic bounce. It thudded heavily, losing momentum faster than it should. The physics of this world punished motion. Stark took to the air, his repulsors flaring blue-white, illuminating the hideous snarling faces of the enemy. He fired a unibeam blast, vaporizing a cluster of orcs. But the heat didn't dissipate. It lingered, scorching the air, and the smell of burning rotten meat filled the canyon. He realized with horror that his targeting systems were failing to lock. The orcs didn't have thermal signatures that matched human physiology. They were cold, dead things. He had to aim manually. Below, Natasha and Clint were a whirlwind of efficiency. Natasha moved like liquid shadow, using the orc's own momentum against them, her knives finding gaps in the crude armor. But for every one she killed, 2 more scrambled over the corpse. These creatures didn't fight with tactics. They fought with hate. Clint fired, his arrows true, but he saw an orc take a shaft through the shoulder and keep coming, driven by a berserker fury that ignored pain. He switched to explosive tips, and the canyon echoed with detonations that sent showers of rock and black blood raining down. Bruce Banner was curled in a ball behind the wreckage, clutching his head. The voices in the static were getting louder, leaking into his mind. They were whispering about power, about a ring, about the weakness of flesh. He screamed, his eyes flashing green. The stress was too much. The transformation was not the heroic surge of the Avengers. It was a painful, bone-breaking eruption of survival instinct. The Hulk exploded outward, grabbing an orc in each hand and pulping them. He leaped into the thick of the swarm, a green cannonball of rage. But even the Hulk seemed diminished here. His skin burned where the black blood of the orcs touched him. The ground didn't crack under his feet as easily as concrete. He was strong, godlike compared to the orcs, but he was lifting the weight of the world with every punch. Thor swung Mjolnir, calling down lightning. A bolt struck the ridge, blasting a squad of archers into ash. But the lightning was different. It was not the clean, blue-white electricity of the storm. It was jagged, yellowish, and it left a taste of ozone and ozone burn in his mouth. He felt a resistance in the sky, as if the clouds themselves were fighting his command. He realized then that the weather here was not a natural system to be manipulated. but a manifestation of a dark will. He was wrestling for control of the storm with another entity. The skirmish lasted 20 minutes. The Avengers stood victorious, surrounded by heaps of mangled orc corpses, but they were panting, exhausted in a way that defied their conditioning. The air offered no sustenance. The silence returned, heavier than before. Cap retrieved his shield, wiping black slime from the star on his chest. He looked at Stark, who had landed heavily, his suit warning of overheating. They had won a brawl, but the strategic picture was nightmare. They had made noise, they had shown light, and in the distance, the red eye atop the dark tower seemed to flare, turning its gaze toward the arid Lithui. They could not stay. The geography of the crash site was a trap. Rogers pointed to the narrow pass leading southwest, towards the rocky, jagged spurs that might offer cover. They moved out. A procession of the lost. Stark walked, saving power. Hulk remained transformed, hulking along the rear, growling at the shadows. They marched for hours across the razor-sharp rocks, the landscape unrelenting in its ugliness. There was no vegetation, only thorns and briars that seemed to reach for their legs. Water was the immediate crisis. Thor found a trickle of black water seeping from a fissure, but after tasting a drop, he spat it out, warning that it was poison, tainted with the sorcery of the land. They were dehydrating, and the heat was rising as they descended toward the plateau. As night fell, or what passed for night in a land where the sun was always choked, they took shelter in a shallow cave. Stark managed to interface his suit sensors with a passive scan mode, creating a rudimentary radar. What he saw stopped his heart. The plateau of Gorgoroth was not empty. It was an industrial complex of war. Campfires numbered in the tens of thousands. Massive siege engines were being dragged by beasts the size of houses. This was not a primitive uprising. It was a mobilized nation dedicated to total war. He showed the hologram to Rogers. The captain stared at the red dots, realizing the scale of the enemy. In New York, they had fought an army. Here, they were standing in the middle of a mobilized continent. Natasha sat by the cave entrance, cleaning her weapons. She was the first to notice the psychological toll. Clint was staring at his hands, muttering. The whispers were affecting them all. It was a low-level psychic pressure, a constant suggestion of despair. Why fight? Why not lie down? The ringwraiths were not near yet, but their master's presence was omnipresent. Natasha, trained to resist interrogation and brainwashing, recognized the symptoms of subliminal assault. She warned the others. This wasn't just geography. It was a hostile psychic environment. They had to fortify their minds. Stark had Jarvis run a cognitive dissonance algorithm, playing random white noise patterns in their comms to break the signal. It helped, but the headache remained. Morning brought no light, only a graying of the dark. They had to move. They needed to find high ground to get a better vantage, or perhaps find a way out of this bowl of mountains. They climbed a ridge overlooking the valley of Uden. It was there they saw the Black Gate, the Morannon. It was closed, a wall of iron and stone that spanned the pass, manned by thousands. There was no way out that way. They were trapped inside Mordor. It was then that the sky shrieked again. This time it was not a ship. 9 winged shadows detached themselves from the towers of the Morannon and circled high, descending in a spiral pattern toward the Avengers' position. The Nazgul. They had found the intruders. The fear that hit the team was irrational and paralyzing. Even Hulk whimpered, taking a step back. The despair was weaponized. Cap dropped to one knee, gasping, feeling the will to lead drain out of him like blood from a severed artery. Thor roared a challenge, raising his hammer. his divine nature rebelling against the ghost fear. He threw Mjolnir at the lead beast. The hammer flew true, striking the fell beast in the chest. The creature exploded in a cloud of gore and its rider fell, a cloaked nothingness plummeting to the rocks. But the rider did not die. It stood up, its cloak swirling, and drew a Morgul blade that wept pale light. The other 8 landed, surrounding the Avengers. The Witch King of Angmar stepped forward, his unseen face turned toward Thor. The clash of cosmologies was immediate. The Witch King spoke words in the black speech that cracked the stone under their feet. Thor answered with lightning. The bolt struck the Witch King's sword, and the explosion threw everyone back. It was not a collision of energy, it was a collision of laws. The magic of the ring wraith sought to unmake the reality of the lightning, to turn it into shadow. The lightning sought to burn the shadow. The result was a paradoxal wave that shorted out Stark's suit completely. He fell, a dead weight in a metal coffin. Rogers shook off the fear through sheer force of will, the super soldier serum firing his adrenaline. He charged the Witch King to protect the prone Stark. The Morgul blade descended, and Rogers caught it on his shield. The sound was not metal on metal. It was the scream of a dying star. The vibranium held, but the force drove Rogers into the ground up to his knees. He felt the cold of the blade travel through the shield, through his arm, seeking his heart. It was a cold that burned. Hulk roared, a sound of defiance against the fear, and charged the circle of wraiths. He smashed one with a backhand that shattered the wraith's physical form, sending the cloak and armor flying. But the spirit remained, a screeching void that latched onto the Hulk's mind. Banner screamed inside the monster, feeling the cold seep into the Hulk's rage, turning it into something brittle and icy. Natasha and Clint fired into the hoods of the wraiths, but their weapons did little damage. Bullets passed through, arrows burned up. They needed magic or something like it. Thor recovered, realizing that physical force was meaningless here. He called on the storm again, not to strike, but to blind. He summoned a whirlwind of dust and static, a localized tornado that engulfed the ridge. "Move!" he bellowed. Rogers dragged Stark. Hulk grabbed Natasha and Clint. They threw themselves off the ridge, sliding down a treacherous slope of loose shale, vanishing into the smoke and dust of the whirlwind. The Nazgul shrieked in frustration, their prey lost in the chaotic magical storm Thor had whipped up. The Avengers tumbled down into a ravine, battered, bruised, and terrified. They came to rest in a dark crevice, hidden from the sky. Stark managed to reboot his systems, the arc reactor glowing dimly. He popped his faceplate, coughing up dust. He looked at the others. They were bleeding. They were shaken. They had fought gods and aliens before, but this was different. This enemy couldn't be punched. "We need a plan," Cap rasped, nursing his arm where the cold still lingered. "We need an exit," Clint countered, checking his quiver. "I have 12 arrows left. And those things, they didn't bleed." "We are in the realm of a necromancer," Thor said heavily, leaning on his hammer. "This land is a graveyard that does not sleep. We must find the light, or we will become part of the dark." It was then that they heard the skittering. Not orcs, something smaller. Something that crawled on the rock face above them with sticky, wet hands. 2 large, luminous eyes peered over the edge of the ravine. Gollum looked down at the shiny metal men, his curiosity overcoming his caution. He saw the green one, he saw the man of iron, and he saw that they were lost. "Thieves," Gollum hissed to himself, his voice carrying softly in the silence. "Thieves and nasties, but tasty, perhaps." The Avengers looked up. They didn't know it, but their timeline had just intersected with the fate of the ring. They were deep in enemy territory, with no supply line, no extraction plan. and the Dark Lord now knew exactly where they were. The breach was closed. The war had begun, and the first casualty was their certainty that they were the most powerful beings in the room. In Middle-earth, power was not a statistic, it was a burden, and the weight was already crushing them. The Avengers huddled in the dark, the eye of Sauron sweeping the mountains like a lighthouse beam from hell, searching for the anomaly that dared to bleed light into his kingdom. The silence of the ravine was not safety. It was merely a pause before the next atrocity. The creature that emerged from the shadows of the ravine did not register on Tony Stark's threat assessment algorithms as a combatant, but rather as a biological anomaly, a withered husk of malnutrition and spinal deformity that moved with a fluid, liquid silence defying the jagged terrain. Gollum did not approach them with the aggression of the orcs or the terrifying majesty of the ring-wraiths. He came with a snivelling, cautious curiosity, his large, luminous eyes reflecting the dying blue glow of the arc reactor like twin moons in a stagnant pond. To Captain Rogers, the creature appeared as a victim, a civilian casualty of this brutal world, emaciated and scarred by whips. To Natasha Romanoff, he scanned as an informant, a desperate asset whose loyalty was non-existent, but whose utility was high. To Thor, the creature reeked of a curse so ancient and profound that it made the dark magic of the surrounding rocks seem almost superficial. Gollum halted 10 paces from them, his gaze flickering rapidly between the green giant, whose breathing sounded like a bellows in the deep earth, and the shining man, whose chest held a captive star. The negotiation was brief and fraught with a linguistic dissonance that strained the Avengers' patience. Gollum spoke of the yellow face, and the white face, and the eye, metaphors that Rogers struggled to pass into tactical data. But the creature's offer was clear enough. He knew the secret ways. He knew how to move beneath the gaze of the towers. He claimed to hate the Orcsies and the wraiths on wings with a venom that spat from his throat like bile. Stark, monitoring his power levels which had dipped to 11%, advocated for immediate utilization of the asset. The suit's life support was struggling to filter the heavy metal particulates from the air, and the arc reactor was running hot, its palladium core reacting strangely to the ambient isotopic decay of the Mordor landscape. They needed a guide, or they would die of exposure before the enemy even found them. Rogers, despite a deep, instinctual revulsion to the creature's duplicitous manner, agreed. They could not hold the ravine. The patrol patterns of the orcs were tightening. They moved out under the cover of a false twilight, a grey misery that settled over the Ephel-Duath. Gollum led them not up toward the peaks, but down, into the jagged fissures that ran like varicose veins through the Morgai, the inner fence of Mordor. The terrain was a nightmare of sharp obsidian and choking ash. For the Avengers, accustomed to the aerodynamics of quinjets and the paved geometry of cities, it was a torture of attrition. Hawkeye moved with the easiest grace, his sniper's patience allowing him to match Gollum's silent rhythm. But even he was fraying. He had 12 arrows left. Every shadow looked like a target. He found himself gripping his bow until his knuckles turned white, the whispers in the air gnawing at his focus. The silence of this world was not empty. It was heavy, filled with a malevolent attention that made the hair on his arm stand up. The first catastrophe of adaptation occurred 6 hours into the march. Stark collapsed. It was not a stumble, but a complete system seizure. The Mark 7, a pinnacle of Earth's engineering, suddenly lost servo coordination in the left leg and lower spine. Stark hit the ground with the sound of a falling engine block, gasping as the suit's weight crushed down on him. The display inside his helmet strobed red. Critical fail. Unknown energy signature detected in power core. Rogers and Thor were there instantly, hauling the armored Avenger into the cover of a rocky overhang. Stark popped the faceplate, his face slick with sweat, eyes wide with a panic he rarely showed. The arc reactor was pulsing with a sickly, violet rhythm, out of sync with his heartbeat. He explained, gasping, that the reactor was acting like a lightning rod. The energy field of Mordor, the very atmosphere, was semi-conductive to the specific frequencies of his repulsor tech. It wasn't just draining the battery, it was infecting it. The clean energy of the arc was being contaminated by the background radiation of Sauron's sorcery. Banner, looking haggard and grey, knelt beside him. He warned Stark that if the core breached, it wouldn't just kill Tony. The magnetic containment failure would likely trigger a detonation equivalent to a tactical nuke, but laced with this dark, corrupting energy. They had a choice. Shut the suit down and drag 300 pounds of dead weight through a war zone, or find a way to stabilize the reaction. Stark, his ego and survival instinct warring behind his eyes, refused to abandon the armor. It was his skin. Without it, he was just a man with a bad heart in a land of monsters. He proposed a modification. He would bypass the safety regulators and convert the intake systems to accept the ambient geothermal heat and static charge of the environment. He would turn the suit into a filter, burning the dirty energy of Mordor to keep the lights on. Thor warned against it. He felt the malice in the ground, the blood of the earth as he called it. To invite that into one's breast was madness. But Stark was already working, his fingers flying over the holographic interface, rewriting the firmware code. When he re-engaged the core, the sound was different. The hum was gone, replaced by a low, throaty growl, like a furnace drafting air. The blue light of the chest piece dimmed and shifted to a harsh, incandescent white with a flickering orange edge. Stark stood up, the servos whining with a new, aggressive pitch. He said he felt fine. He said the power levels were at 200%, but his voice sounded tinny, distant, and when he looked at Rogers, the HUD overlaid a targeting reticle for a microsecond before blinking away. The suit was running on the fumes of hell, and it was hungry. Gollum watched from the shadows, his eyes wide, muttering about fiery eyes and wheels of fire. He sensed the change. The shiny man was no longer just metal. He was becoming something else, something closer to the Dark Lord's own creations. They pushed on, fueled by Stark's newfound terrifying energy. The landscape shifted from barren rock to the industrial scar tissue of the war machine. They crested a ridge and looked down into a valley that should have been empty, but was instead a sprawling complex of misery. It was a slave camp, a supply depot for the armies gathering at the Black Gate. Thousands of human slaves, men from the east and south, were chained in lines, dragging massive blocks of stone and cranking the gears of deep-bore mining drills. The air was thick with the smoke of rendering pits where the dead were disposed of. Orc overseers cracked whips that sounded like pistol shots. It was a scene of industrial cruelty that rivaled the worst horrors of the 20th century, but amplified by the scale of fantasy. This was the breaking point for Captain America. The mission, technically, was survival and extraction, but Steve Rogers did not operate on technicalities. He looked at the suffering below. The starving men, the beaten women, and the soldier took over. He turned to the group, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. He stated that they were taking the camp, not for supplies, not for intel, but because it was there and it was evil. Natasha argued. She played the devil's advocate. pointing out they were 6 against thousands, behind enemy lines, with limited ammo and a compromised power source. Clint agreed with her. This wasn't their war. They needed to get home. But Thor stepped up next to Cap. The god of thunder looked down at the slavery and pronounced it an affront to the dignity of life. He would not walk past it. Banner, holding his arms, looked terrified. He knew that if he fought here, the Hulk would come out, and he wasn't sure he could put him back in. The atmosphere was making the other guy angry in a way that felt foreign, a cold, resentful rage rather than hot fury. The tactical plan was a compromise. They would strike the command structure, the central keep, where the orc captains and the darker, taller overseers resided, create a panic, liberate the slaves, and vanish into the chaos. Stark, high on his new power supply, was eager. He claimed he could overload the camp's primitive alarm systems and create a diversionary fire. Gollum wailed, biting his own hand, terrified of the noise, but he was ignored. He slunk away into the rocks, abandoning them to their foolishness. He knew what watched this valley. He knew that silence was the only armor, and they had just discarded it. The assault began with an arrow. Hawkeye, perched on a high spur, loosed a shaft that dropped the sentry on the main watchtower. Before the body hit the ground, Cap and Widow were moving. They descended the scree slope like avalanche debris, hitting the perimeter guard with a violence that was swift and silent. Cap's shield work was brutal. He wasn't just knocking them out, he was shattering bones, ensuring they didn't get up. The physics of the shield were still slightly off, the rebounds duller, requiring him to exert more force, which tired him faster. Widow used the orc's own weapons, slicing throats with jagged scimitars, her face a mask of cold concentration. They breached the outer wall. Then Stark initiated the diversion. He flew low over the slave pits, his repulsors firing pulses of the converted Mordor energy. The effect was catastrophic. The blast didn't just impact. They detonated with a thermal intensity that melted the chains and the stone alike. But the fire was uncontrollable. It spread like oil, a sticky, clinging flame that consumed oxygen. The panic was instantaneous. Thousands of slaves stampeded. The orcs rallied, blowing great brass horns that echoed off the mountains. The element of surprise evaporated in seconds. The keep doors burst open, and out poured not just orcs, but Olog High, massive war trolls clad in plate iron, wielding hammers that weighed as much as a car. And leading them was a figure that froze the blood in Thor's veins. It was a black Numenorian, a sorcerer king of the south, serving Sauron. He wore armor that seemed to absorb the light, and he carried a staff topped with a skull that wept black smoke. He did not shout orders, he simply pointed his staff, and a wave of force slammed into the Avengers, knocking them off their feet. Hulk roared. It was the trigger. Banner lost control, and the green Goliath erupted from the wreckage of a supply wagon. He charged the trolls, a collision of titans that shook the ground. But as Hulk grappled with an Olog High, tearing the armor from its flesh, the black blood of the troll sprayed over him. It sizzled on his skin. Hulk screamed, a sound of genuine pain. The blood was toxic, acidic with dark magic. It didn't just burn, it intoxicated. The Hulk's eyes, usually a pure, angry green, began to vein with black. His strength spiked, but so did his cruelty. He didn't just kill the troll, he dismantled it, limb from limb, laughing a guttural, wet laugh that didn't belong to Banner. Thor engaged the sorcerer. Mjolnir met the black staff. The collision created a shockwave that flattened the nearest building. The sorcerer was strong, fed by the power of the Barad-dûr, which loomed in the distance. He spoke words of power that turned the air into heavy chains, binding Thor's arms. Thor struggled, summoning lightning, but the storm clouds above were under Sauron's command. The lightning that came down was thin, weak, and the sorcerer caught it on his staff, redirecting it at Hawkeye. Clint dived, but the blast caught his quiver, incinerating his remaining arrows and burning his side. He was out of the fight, scrambling for cover with a combat knife. Stark saw his team failing. Cap was surrounded by 100 orcs, his shield arm heavy, bleeding from a dozen cuts. Widow was cornered. Hulk was losing his mind to the bloodlust. Stark made the decision that defined the catastrophe. He hovered above the central keep, the heart of the enemy's control. His HUD showed the geothermal tap, the vents that powered the camp's forges, running directly beneath the fortress. He reasoned that if he injected his suit's total capacitor charge into the vent, it would cause a steam explosion, destroying the keep and the sorcerer. It was a tactical nuke strategy. "Clear the zone," Stark screamed over the comms, his voice distorted by the static of his corrupted power core. Rogers heard him. He looked at the slaves still trapped in the inner courtyard, too terrified to move. "Tony, no, there are civilians." "We're dead if I don't," Stark retorted. The logic of the machine had taken over. The corrupted energy in his suit demanded release. He didn't wait for the order. He dive-bombed the main vent, slamming his fists into the grate and unleashing the unibeam at maximum yield. The reaction was not what he calculated. The physics of Middle-earth did not obey thermodynamics alone. The vent was not just a heat source. It was a ley line, a vein of the Earth's corruption connected to the mountain of fire itself. Stark didn't just cause an explosion. He created a sympathetic resonance with Mount Doom. The ground didn't just crack, it liquefied. A pillar of magma and shadow fire erupted from the earth, vaporizing the keep instantly. But the shockwave didn't stop. It traveled outward through the rock, shattering the foundations of the entire valley floor. The slave pits, carved into the unstable rock, collapsed. The earth swallowed them. Thousands of screams were cut short as the valley floor dropped 50 feet in a chaotic implosion of stone and fire. The Avengers were thrown like rag dolls by the blast. Rogers was buried under a pile of rubble, his ears ringing with the silence that follows a massacre. He clawed his way out, coughing dust, his eyes frantic. He looked for the slaves. He looked for the people he had sworn to save. They were gone. The entire central section of the camp was a smoking crater. The slaves, the orcs, the machinery, all buried under millions of tons of rock. The rescue had turned into a mass grave. Stark landed hard on a ledge, his suit smoking, the white light of his chest piece now pulsing with a steady red rhythm. He looked at his hands. The metal of his gloves was fused, warped by the heat, and looked strangely organic, like insect chitin. He had survived, but he had changed. He looked down at the destruction. I miscalculated," he whispered. "The variable, the magic variable." Thor pulled himself from the debris, bleeding from his scalp. He looked at Stark, not with camaraderie, but with horror. He looked at the devastation. "You did not miscalculate, Man of Iron," Thor said, his voice low and trembling with a rage that was terrifyingly quiet. "You awoke the earth. You used the enemy's weapon against him, and it obeyed its master. The sorcerer was dead, crushed in the collapse, but the victory was ash. The surviving orcs on the perimeter were fleeing, not fighting. They were fleeing because something else had awoken. From the direction of Barad-dûr, a light swept across the sky. The Great Eye had seen the explosion. It had seen the power signature, and it recognized it. Hulk sat amidst the ruins of the trolls, panting. The black veins on his skin were receding, but he looked sick, retching bile onto the grey stones. Banner was trying to claw his way back, but the Hulk was scared to let go, afraid of the pain. Rogers limped over to the edge of the crater. He stared down at the burial ground he had ordered them to enter. His shield hung heavy on his arm. He had led them here. He had insisted on the moral high ground, and the result was total annihilation. The scholarly consistency of this universe had exerted its rule. Power without understanding yields tragedy. The Avengers' methods, escalation, explosive force, technological superiority, were incompatible with a world where the Earth itself was alive and malevolent. Widow found Clint. He was alive, but his burns were severe. He wouldn't be shooting a bow anytime soon. "We need to move," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The spy masking the trauma. "We made a beacon. Everything in this country is coming here." They retreated, not as heroes, but as fugitives. They climbed the western ridge, leaving the burning ruin of the slave camp behind. As they crested the top, Stark looked back. The smoke from the crater was rising in a perfect straight column, unbothered by the wind. It looked like a finger pointing at the sky, or an accusation. Gollum was waiting for them on the other side. He didn't mock them. He didn't speak. He just looked at Stark with a new kind of reverence. He saw the destruction. He saw the death. And in his twisted mind, he recognized a kindred spirit. The shiny man was a destroyer now. "Precious," Gollum whispered to the rocks as Stark limped past. "He carries a little precious in his chest." "Yes, burning, burning." The Avengers broken. They had not just lost a fight. They had lost their identity. They were no longer the protectors. In Middle-earth, they were a natural disaster, and the noise of their failure echoed all the way to the throne of the Dark Lord, who now knew with absolute certainty that a power capable of challenging him had arrived, and that it was reckless enough to be manipulated. The stage was set not for a war of armies, but for the corruption of the soul. The Avengers were in Mordor, and Mordor was beginning to get in them. The silence that followed the destruction of the slave camp was not the quiet of peace, but the suffocating vacuum of atrocity committed in a land that thrived on despair. The Avengers moved west, climbing the jagged spine of the Morgai Ridge, their formation broken and their spirits crushed under the weight of the thousands they had buried beneath the rock. There was no banter, no tactical coordination, only the grim, mechanical trudging of soldiers who had lost their war before the first real battle was joined. Tony Stark walked at the rear, the gait of his Mark VII armor lurching and uneven. The suit was no longer gleaming gold and hot rod red. The ash of Mordor had baked into the finish, turning it a dull, bruised crimson and charcoal. But the physical scarring was nothing compared to the internal metamorphosis of the machine. The arc reactor, having tasted the geothermal blood of the mountain and the dark ley lines of the earth, was pulsing with a rhythmic, wet, thrumming sound, like a second heart beating against a rib cage of titanium. Inside the helmet, the heads-up display was a nightmare of glitching telemetry. The target identification software was overlaying ancient runic scripts upon the landscape, translating the geometry of the rocks into a language Stark did not know, but intuitively understood to be hateful. Jarvis was speaking, but the voice was dropping in pitch, the smooth British cadence occasionally fracturing into a guttural, subharmonic growl that vibrated in Stark's fillings. He was running hot, his body temperature spiking as the suit fed not just on the ambient energy, but on his own bioelectric field, creating a parasitic loop that kept him awake, alert, and aggressive. Captain Rogers led the way, his shield arm hanging uselessly by his side, the muscles torn from the impact of the shockwave. He refused to look back at the plume of smoke rising from the valley. His moral compass, usually the North Star of the team, was spinning wildly. In New York, collateral damage was a failure condition. Here, it seemed to be the physics of the realm. He looked at Natasha Romanoff, walking a few paces ahead of him. She was limping, supporting Clint Barton, whose burns were weeping clear fluid, refusing to clot in the sterile, dry air. They were mortal in a land of immortals and monsters, and the fragility of their biology was becoming the defining crisis of the mission. They needed rest, they needed sterile water, and they needed hope. But the landscape offered only razor-sharp obsidian and pools of bitter, alkaline sludge. Thor Odinson walked alone, separated from the group by a gulf of shame. He was a god, a prince of the Golden Realm, yet he had stood by and watched a mortal machine trigger a cataclysm that mirrored the worst excesses of the fire giants. He gripped Mjolnir until the leather wrappings creaked. The hammer felt heavier with each mile. It was not a physical weight, but a judgment. The enchantment of Odin. Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, felt like it was testing him, the bond flickering. Was he worthy? He who had failed to protect the weak. He who had allowed the anger of the earth to claim the innocent. He looked up at the sky, seeking the familiar constellations, the path to the Bifrost, but the dark canopy of clouds churned by the will of Sauron blocked all celestial navigation. He was cut off from the All-Father. He was just a strong man with a heavy hammer in a land where strength was measured by cruelty. Gollum scrabbled ahead of them, his mood manic and terrified. He kept glancing back at Stark with a mixture of worship and horror. To Gollum, the man of iron had become a wraith of fire, a new power to be placated. He led them away from the main roads, away from the marching columns of orcs that now flooded the valley floor in response to the explosion, and towards the sheer wall of the Eadfelduath. He promised a way out, a secret stair that led up and over the mountains, past the vigilance of the eye. Rogers debated the wisdom of following the creature. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap, but they had no options. To stay in the Morgai was to be hunted down by the Nazgul, who were already circling the smoke of the camp like vultures. To fight was suicide. They had to cross the mountains. The ascent of the straight stair began at dusk. It was a torture of verticality. The steps were cut into the living rock, steep, narrow, and slick, with the moisture of low-hanging clouds. For the humans, it was a physical ordeal that pushed them to the edge of collapse. Clint, delirious with pain, had to be carried by Thor. The god of thunder bore the archer effortlessly, but the contact with Clint's feverish skin burned him. Clint was muttering, reliving the fall of the slave camp, seeing faces in the stone. The psychological pressure of Mordor was amplifying the trauma. Natasha moved with a grim determination, her spy's mind shutting down all unnecessary functions, focusing only on the placement of feet and hands. She watched Gollum, noting how he seemed to gain strength as they climbed higher, his movements becoming more fluid, more eager. He was leading them to something. She knew it, but she also knew that a known trap was better than the unknown horror of the open plains. Hulk brought up the rear. This was the most dangerous variable. Bruce Banner was gone. The trauma of the troll blood infection and the psychic assault of the environment had forced a regression. The Hulk that climbed the stairs was not the savage child or the gladiator. He was a silent, brooding monolith. His skin was a darker shade of green, veined with grey, and his eyes were small, red-rimmed, and intelligent in a malign way. He did not roar, he did not smash. He climbed with a predatory efficiency, his massive fingers digging into the stone, leaving crushed indentations. He was adapting to the environment by becoming part of it. The rage was calcifying into hate. Stark's sensors picked up the shift in the Hulk's gamma signature. The radiation was no longer emitting outwards. It was imploding, becoming a dense gravitational sink. The Hulk was absorbing the background radiation of the dark magic, fueling his strength with the very essence of Mordor. They reached the top of the first stair and collapsed on a narrow ledge. The air was thin and cold, biting at their exposed skin. Below them, the fires of the slave camp were a distant smudge. Above them, the winding stair twisted up into the darkness, disappearing into a tunnel mouth that looked like an open throat. Gollum urged them on, his voice a frantic whisper. Up, 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 mustn't stop. The race will see. The eye will see. Stark sat against the rock wall, his suit whirring. He didn't open the faceplate. He couldn't. The air inside the suit was now a recycled mix of oxygen and the strange metallic exhaust of the modified reactor. He was breathing the machine. I'm picking up a massive energy signature ahead, Stark said, his voice synthesized and flat. Biological. Immense. It's not a machine. It's old. Everything here is old, Rogers rasped, drinking the last of their water. Is it hostile? It's hungry, Stark replied. The readings, they look like a void. It's absorbing light, literally eating the photons. Thor looked at the tunnel mouth. He felt it too. A damp, cloying cold that smelled of rot and ancient dust. Ungoliant, he whispered. A name from the deepest archives of Asgardian lore. The primeval darkness. This is her kin. We go through, Rogers said, standing up. We have to. They entered the tunnel of Torek Ungol. The darkness was absolute. It was not merely the absence of light. It was a physical substance that pressed against their eyes. Stark's floodlights flared, but the beams were swallowed after a few feet, the light decaying rapidly as if the air itself was resisting illumination. Night vision was useless. The sensors showed only static. They were blind. They had to rely on touch and sound. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of boots and the wheezing breath of the injured. The air grew foul, thick with a stench that triggered a primal gag reflex, the smell of slow digestion. Then the webs began. Thick, sticky strands that spanned the width of the tunnel, stronger than steel cables. Stark tried to cut one with the laser cutter, but the beam diffracted, scattering uselessly. He had to tear it with his gauntlets, the servos whining at maximum torque. It's not silk, he muttered. It's polymerized shadow. High tensile strength, zero conductivity. Quiet, Natasha hissed. She felt a vibration in the floor, a tremor that wasn't geological. Something was moving in the dark, something with too many legs. The attack did not come from the front, but from above and everywhere at once. Shelob did not hunt like a beast. She hunted like a horror. She dropped from the ceiling, a massive bulk of chitin and malice, landing silently despite her tonnage. She was faster than logic allowed. Before the Avengers could react, she had separated them. A massive leg, tipped with a spike the size of a spear, slammed down between Thor and Cap, shattering the stone floor. Another swept Clint and Natasha against the wall, pinning them with a spray of webbing that hardened instantly. Contact! Rogers screamed, raising his shield. Shelob struck the vibranium. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. Rogers was thrown back into the darkness, his shield ringing with a dull, dead note. The spider didn't pursue him. She turned her many eyes towards the brightest thing in the dark. Tony Stark. Stark fired everything. Repulsors, micro-missiles, the unibeam. The tunnel lit up in a strobe-like chaos of explosions. But the fire didn't burn her. Shelob drank it. The energy of the Stark tech, corrupted by Mordor, was delicious to her. She absorbed the blasts into her carapace, glowing with a sickly internal light. She lunged, her chelicerae dripping with poison, clamping onto the Mark VII's shoulder. Metal crunched. Stark screamed as the fangs pierced the titanium gold alloy and sank into the meat of his shoulder. The suit's integrity failed. The poison entered his bloodstream. It wasn't just venom. It was a narcotic nightmare. Stark's mind fractured. He saw the tunnel fall away. He saw the earth burning. He saw himself on a throne of skulls, ruling a dead world with cold, efficient logic. The suit, reacting to the biological distress, injected a cocktail of adrenaline and stimulants. But it also diverted power to the offensive systems, overriding the safety protocols. Stark became a flailing gun turret, firing blindly, blowing chunks out of the tunnel walls, risking a cave-in. Thor hurled Mjolnir. The hammer struck Shelob in the cluster of eyes, blinding her on the left side. She shrieked, a sound that tore at the sanity of everyone who heard it. It was the sound of the void screaming. Thor summoned the lightning, calling it down through the mountain rock. It was a desperate move. The bolt arced through the ceiling, shattering the stone, and struck the spider. For a moment, the Asgardian divine energy clashed with the void spawn. Light against anti-light. The flash blinded them all. Shelob recoiled, burned by the purity of the storm, but she lashed out in her retreat. Her spinnerets sprayed a massive glob of web at Thor, entangling him, pinning his arms to his sides, binding Mjolnir to his chest. He struggled, but the web tightened with his movements. Hulk, who had been lagging behind, finally arrived. He didn't rush. He walked out of the gloom, seeing the chaos. He saw the monster, and he smiled. The Dark Hulk didn't see a predator. He saw a challenger. He charged, not with a roar, but with a tackle. He slammed into Shelob's side, his density incredible. The two monsters rolled in the dark, smashing against the walls. It was a brawl of titans. Shelob bit him, her fangs sinking into the green muscle. Hulk didn't scream. He snarled. The poison met the gamma radiation and the troll blood infection. His immune system went nuclear. The wound boiled. Hulk ripped one of Shelob's legs out of its socket. Black ichor sprayed, dissolving the rock where it landed. But Shelob was ancient. She had fed on the light of the trees of Valinor. A Hulk was merely meat. She stabbed him repeatedly with her remaining legs, impaling him, pinning him to the floor. She loomed over him, preparing to wrap him, to save him for a later meal. "Steve!" Natasha's voice cut through the chaos. She was pinned, helpless. Clint was unconscious beside her. The tunnel. Collapse the tunnel. Rogers, recovering from the blow, realized the tactical situation was a checkmate. They couldn't kill her. Not here. Not in her domain. They had to escape, or they had to bury her. He looked at Stark, who was convulsing, his suit firing random blasts. He looked at Thor, bound and struggling. He looked at the exit, a faint glimmer of grey light far ahead. "Tony!" Cap yelled, throwing his shield to sever the web holding Stark's helmet. The shield sliced the strand, ricocheting back. "Bring it down. Aim for the ceiling." Stark, delirious, heard the command. His tactical computer identified the structural weak point, a massive keystone in the arch of the tunnel. "Targeting," he slurred. The chest piece glowed with a blinding intensity. He unleashed the unibeam, not at the spider, but at the roof. The mountain groaned. The blast vaporized the support rock. Thousands of tons of rock began to fall. "Move," Thor bellowed, ripping himself free of the web with a surge of god strength that tore his cloak and armor. He grabbed the nearest limb of the Hulk and heaved the green monster out from under the spider. Shelob shrieked as the ceiling came down on her, burying her under the weight of the Eiffel Darth. The Avengers scrambled for the exit. It was a race against the collapse. Dust billowed out, choking them. They dived out of the tunnel mouth, tumbling onto a high rocky shelf, gasping for air. Behind them, the tunnel sealed itself with a final, thunderous crash. They were alive, but the cost was visible. Stark lay on his back, the faceplate open. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated to different sizes. Black veins were spreading from the puncture wound on his shoulder, tracing up his neck. He was muttering equations, mixing physics with the black speech he had heard from the ringwraiths. The poison had unlocked a part of his brain that understood the dark technology of Sauron, but it was rewriting his morality. Hulk sat on the edge of the cliff, pulling a 3-foot-long sting fragment out of his chest. The wound didn't close immediately. It steamed. He looked at the others with a look of pure contempt. He had saved them, and he hated them for it. Clint was awake, but he was blind. The venom spray had glazed his eyes. "Nat," he whispered, reaching out. "I can't. It's all grey." Natasha held his hand, her face a mask of stone. "I'm here, Clint. We're out." But they weren't out. They looked up. They had emerged from the tunnel not into freedom, but into the courtyard of the tower of Cirith Ungol. The fortress loomed over them, a jagged tooth of black stone, and on the battlements, waiting for them, were the silent watchers. The 2 watchers, statues inhabited by evil spirits, glowed with an inner malice. The gate was barred, and the garrison was awake. The alarm was raised, not a horn, but a psychic shriek that emanated from the tower itself. The Avengers were trapped on the ledge, the blocked tunnel behind them, the fortress in front of them, and a sheer drop of 1,000 feet to the left. It was then that the sky changed. The clouds parted, not from wind, but from a force of will. A beam of red light, focused and intense, swung from the distant Barad-dûr. The eye of Sauron fixed upon them. It didn't just see them, it touched them. Stark screamed, arching his back. His heart turned entirely red. A voice spoke in his head, clear, metallic, and seductive. It was not the voice of a monster, but of an architect. "Builder," the voice resonated in his skull. "You seek order. You seek to fix the flaw. Your metal is weak. Your power is crude. Bring it to me. I can show you the perfect machine." Stark stopped screaming. He went limp, then slowly sat up. The white light of his arc reactor flickered and turned a deep burning orange. He looked at the tower of Cirith Ungol. He stood up, the servos moving smoothly, the damage from the fight seemingly ignored by the suit's override systems. "Tony?" Cap asked, stepping forward. "Tony, snap out of it." Stark turned his head. The faceplate slammed shut. The electronic eyes glowed red. "I see the pattern now, Steve," Stark said, his voice void of humanity. "The chaotic variable. It's us. We're the glitch. This world. It has a system, a master system." "He's been breached," Thor warned, raising the hammer. "The enemy is in his mind." "No," Stark said, raising his gauntlets. "He's just giving me the schematics." The garrison of Cirith Ungol poured out of the gates, Uruks of the highest order, armored in heavy plate. But they didn't attack. They formed a perimeter. They were waiting. A figure emerged from the ranks. It was not an orc. It was a man, a mouth of Sauron, though not the one from the Black Gate. This was an emissary of the Iron Tower. He bowed low to Stark. "The Lord of the Earth welcomes the man of iron," the emissary hissed. The invite is extended, to the Dark Tower, to the Forge. Stark looked at his teammates. He looked at the broken Hulk, the blinded Hawkeye, the exhausted Captain. "I can fix this," Stark said. "I just need the tools." "Tony, don't do it," Rogers pleaded. "It's a lie." "Is it?" Stark pointed his repulsors at Captain America. "Or is it just efficiency? We are losing Steve, because we are small. I need to be big." Stark ignited his thrusters. He didn't attack them. He simply launched himself into the air, flying not away from Mordor, but deeper into it, straight towards the Barad-dûr, straight towards the Eye. The Avengers stood stunned on the ledge as the Uruks advanced, weapons drawn. They had lost their heavy artillery. They had lost their tech. And they were about to lose their freedom. The clash of systems had occurred, and the corrupting order of Sauron had found a compatible interface in the technological ego of Tony Stark. The Fellowship was broken. The War of the Ring had just acquired a weapon of mass destruction, and it was flying home to its new master. The iron doors of the Tower of Cirith Ungol did not close with a clang, but with a dull, heavy thud that swallowed hope. The Avengers, stripped of their primary weapons and bound in chains of black metal, forged in the fires of the mountain, were dragged through corridors that smelled of old sweat, sour fear, and the copper tang of blood that had never dried. They were not thrown into a dungeon. They were hauled into the high chambers of the tower, a place where the silent watchers could gaze upon them with unseen spiritual eyes. The Uruks who held them were wary, their crude hands gripping the prisoners with a mixture of brutality and superstitious dread. They had seen the green beast fight. They had seen the thunder god cool down the sky. Even in chains, these prisoners vibrated with a power that the orcs respected, a power that tasted of the high ancient world that the shadows sought to devour. Captain Rogers was forced to his knees in the center of the room. His uniform was in tatters, the star on his chest obscured by layers of grime and dried ichor. He looked at his team. Natasha was silent, her eyes scanning the room, counting guards, assessing angles, calculating the tensile strength of the chains. She was back in the Red Room, mentally. The heroism of the Avengers was a luxury she had discarded the moment the tunnel collapsed. Now she was a weapon waiting for a hand to wield it. Clint Barton sat slumped against the wall, his eyes bandaged with a rag torn from his own tunic. He was shivering, not from cold, but from the sensory overload. Deprived of sight, his other senses were screaming. He could hear the heartbeat of the Uruk captain across the room, a wet, irregular thumping. He could hear the wind howling through the high passes, carrying the screams of things that died in the dark. He was beginning to hear the song of the tower itself, a dissonant hum of malice that threatened to split his skull. And in the corner, kept in a cage of thick iron bars, was the Hulk. But it was not the Hulk they knew. The creature sat in the lotus position, motionless. The grey veins on his green skin pulsed in time with the tower's hum. He was not raging. He was listening. The troll blood and the dark magic had rewritten his biochemistry. He was absorbing the ambient gamma radiation of the magical isotopes in the stone. He looked at Rogers with eyes that were too intelligent, too calm, and filled with a cold, reptile loathing. Meanwhile, 100 miles to the east, the trajectory of history was being bent by a single conversation. Tony Stark stood on the balcony of the Barad-dûr, overlooking the plateau of Gorgoroth. He was not in chains. He was not a prisoner. He was a guest. The Mark VII armor had been removed, placed on a rack in a laboratory that would have made Reed Richards weep with envy and terror. The laboratory was a fusion of Stark's futurism and Sauron's ancient craft. Holographic displays floated in the air, projected not by light, but by suspended fire. Runes of power scrolled across screens made of polished obsidian, and at the center of the room, resting on a pedestal of twisted iron, was the Palantir. Stark stood before the Seeing Stone, his mind racing. The corruption that had started in his suit had now interfaced with his biology. The arc reactor in his chest was no longer just a magnet keeping shrapnel from his heart. It was a receiver. He had sought to understand the physics of this world, and the Dark Lord had given him the equation. The equation was simple. Power is finite, but will is infinite. Chaos is the enemy. Order is the goal. A presence materialized behind him. It was not the burning eye, but a figure of towering stature, clad in armor that absorbed the light, a physical avatar of the Maya spirit that ruled this land. Sauron did not speak with a voice, but with a pressure on the mind. He showed Stark the inefficiency of his armies, the waste of biomass in the orc breeding pits, the crude aerodynamics of the fell beasts, the structural weaknesses of the Black Gate. He appealed to Stark the engineer. Stark the futurist. You see the flaw, the presence whispered. The world is broken. Men are weak, divided, chaotic. Elves are stagnant, fading, obsessed with the past. We are the only ones looking forward. We are the builders. Stark looked at the blueprints floating in the fire. He saw a design for a blast furnace that utilized the magma of Orodruin to power a mass production line for plate armor. He saw a schematic for a kinetic energy weapon that could be mounted on the backs of Olog High. He saw a vision of a unified Middle-earth, paved, lit by electric light, ordered, safe. A suit of armor around the world. The power source is the bottleneck, Stark said, his voice devoid of the snark, the wit, the humanity that had defined him. He spoke with the flat affect of a machine. Geothermal is unstable. The ring magic is too dispersed. The breach, Sauron suggested. The wound in the sky you created. It still bleeds. We can harvest it. Stark's eyes widened. The tesseract energy, the residual radiation from their entry. If he could build a collector, a siphon at the point of impact, he could power a new age of industry. He could build the Ultron Initiative, but perfect this time. Organic, magical, eternal. I need access to the Palantir, Stark said. I need to calculate the dimensional coordinates. Take it, the Dark Lord answered. Stark placed his hand on the black sphere. The shock was immediate. His mind was not just connected to the stone. It was flayed open. He saw the network of the stones. He saw the thoughts of Denethor in Minas Tirith, crumbling under despair. He saw the fear of the elves, and he saw the multiverse. He saw the threat that lay beyond the stars. He saw Thanos, and in that moment, the trap snapped shut. Stark's fear, his PTSD from New York, was weaponized against him. He believed with absolute certainty that the only way to save the universe was to turn Middle-earth into a fortress of such terrible power that no Titan would dare approach it. I will build it, Stark whispered. I will build it all. Back in Sereth Ungol, the inflection point arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. Natasha Romanoff had been working on the lock of her manacles for 3 hours. She had no tools, only a small sliver of bone she had scavenged from the floor, a remnant of a previous prisoner. The lock was crude, a tumbler system that relied on strength rather than complexity. She waited until the guards were distracted by a dispute over a game of dice. With a snap of her wrist that dislocated her thumb, she slipped the hand free. The pain was sharp, grounding. She reset the joint with a sickening pop that went unnoticed in the noisy room. She did not rush. She moved like a spider. She approached the nearest Uruk from behind, leaping onto his back and driving the bone shard into his ear canal before he could draw a breath. He dropped without a sound. She caught his scimitar before it hit the floor. The second guard turned, his eyes widening, but she was already moving, a blur of black leather and violent intent. She hamstringed him, silenced him with a boot to the throat, and finished him with the blade. She tossed the keys to Rogers. "Steve, up." Rogers unlocked himself and Thor. He looked at the Hulk. "We need him," Cap said, moving to the cage. "No," Thor said, stopping him. "Look at him, Captain. He is not with us." The Hulk watched them, unblinking. "Go," the Hulk rumbled. His voice was deep, articulate, and terrifying. "The Green One stays. The Green One learns." "Bruce?" Cap asked, horrified. "Bruce is weak," the Hulk said. "Here, the anger is food. Go, little soldier. Before I get hungry." They had no choice. They left the Hulk in the cage, a ticking bomb in the heart of the enemy fortress. They moved into the corridors, fighting their way down. But this was not an escape. It was a running battle. They recovered some gear, Cap's shield, Mjolnir, from a trophy room. But Clint's bow was gone. The archer armed himself with 2 orc daggers. He moved with a frightening synchronization, reacting to the whistle of air before a blade swung. They burst out of the main gate, leaving a trail of bodies behind them. But they were not out of danger. They were on the high pass, exposed, and looking down toward the plains of Gorgoroth, they saw the nightmare that Stark had unleashed. Marching from the direction of Barad-dûr was a legion, but not a ragtag horde of orcs. These were Uruks, clad in uniform plate armor that gleamed with a dull, standardized finish. They marched in perfect lockstep, a mechanical rhythm that shook the ground, and in their hands they carried weapons that were not swords. They were staffs of iron, tipped with glowing red crystals, crude, mass-produced versions of Stark's repulsor tech, powered by sorcery. "By Odin's beard," Thor whispered. "He has armed them with lightning." They watched as a patrol of these new iron Uruks engaged a pack of wild wargs. The Uruks raised their staffs. A volley of red energy bolts tore the air, vaporizing the beasts in seconds. It was a massacre. It was modern warfare brought to a medieval hell. "We can't fight that," Clint said, listening to the hum of the weapons. "That's Tony's signature. Distorted, but it's him." "We have to kill him," Natasha said. Her voice was cold, final. "He's compromised. He's a global threat level. There is no recovery from this." Rogers looked at the army. He looked at the tower in the distance, crowned with the eye. He remembered the friend who had flown a nuke into a wormhole. "We get to him first," Rogers said. "We try to unplug him. And if we can't," Natasha pressed. Rogers tightened his grip on the shield. "Then we do what is necessary." They descended the mountains, moving into the shadows of the ash plains. They needed cover. They needed a plan. And they found the resistance in the most unlikely of places. Hiding in the ruins of an old Gondorian outpost were refugees, not men, but deserters, orcs who had fled the new regime, men of the East who had rejected the mechanization of their gods. And leading them was a ranger of Ithilien, looking haggard and desperate, Faramir. The meeting was tense. Faramir saw the sigils on Thor and Cap and recognized them from the old tales, or perhaps from prophetic dreams. He told them the news. The White City was under siege, but not by catapults. The enemy had built dragons of iron, tanks, great steam-powered machines that were battering down the walls of Minas Tirith. "The wizard Mithrandir fell," Faramir said, his voice breaking. He stood before the Iron Dragon, and its fire consumed him. The staff was broken. Gandalf was dead, killed by Stark tech. The silence that followed was absolute. Thor looked at the ground, a tear tracing a clean line through the dust on his face. The wise guide, the Odin figure of this world, had been erased by the arrogance of their own teammate. "We need to send a message," Roger said. "We need to warn Earth, warn Asgard. If Sauron has this tech, he won't stop at Middle-earth. He'll open the bridge again." "There is a way," Faramir said. "In the tower we fled. There is a stone, one of the 7. We captured it from a Nazgul patrol, but we dare not use it. A Palantir." "I can use it," Thor said. "My mind is shielded by the All-Father." "It is perilous," Faramir warned. "We are past peril," Thor growled. They brought the stone. It was wrapped in heavy cloth. Thor unwrapped it. The surface swirled with dark clouds. "Wait," Natasha said. "If Tony is connected to the network, he'll see us." "Good," Thor said. He placed his hands on the stone. "Let him see." Thor pushed his will into the stone. He didn't seek to see. He sought to project. He called out to Heimdall. He called out to the stars. He screamed his location across the cosmos. "Heimdall, the realm is fallen. The Midgardian has betrayed us. Send the Bifrost. Burn it all." The stone flared, but the connection was intercepted. Not by Heimdall, but by Stark. Inside the Barad door, Stark froze. The HUD in his mind flashed with a priority alert. "Incoming transmission. Source. Gorgoroth. Signature. Thor Odinson." Stark smiled. It was a sad, broken smile. "Point of origin confirmed," he said to the empty room. "Targeting systems online." He didn't send a message back. He sent a coordinate package to the new artillery battery installed on the slopes of Mount Doom. "Fire," Stark commanded. Back in the ruins, the Palantir went black. Thor gasped, pulling his hands back as if burned. He heard me, but he did not answer. "Incoming," Clint screamed, his head snapping toward the mountain. "Supersonic, heavy tonnage." "Take cover," Rogers yelled, throwing himself over Faramir and the civilians. The shell landed. It was not a conventional explosive. It was a Stark Industries Jericho missile, modified with dark sorcery. It didn't just explode. It unmade the area. The shockwave flattened the ruins. The heat turned the sand to glass. When the dust settled, Rogers pushed the rubble off his back. His shield was scorched. He looked around. The refugees were gone, vaporized. Faramir was dead, a piece of shrapnel through his chest. Natasha pulled herself from a crevice. She was bleeding from the ears. Clint was unconscious, buried to his waist. Thor stood in the center of the crater. He was unharmed, his divine durability protecting him. But he was staring at the remains of the Palantir, which had shattered into dust. "He fired on us," Thor whispered. He knew it was us, and he fired. Rogers stood up. He looked at the dead ranger. He looked at the smoking crater that had been a sanctuary. Something inside the captain broke. The code of the comic book hero, the rule against killing, the belief in redemption, shattered under the weight of the reality. This was not a misunderstood teammate. This was a war criminal. Rogers walked over to the corpse of an orc deserter. He picked up a heavy, jagged iron sword. He tested the weight. It was unbalanced, cruel, ugly. It was a weapon of murder, not defense. He strapped his shield to his back. He wouldn't be needing protection. He needed to kill. "We move," Roger said. His voice was unrecognizable. "We go to the mountain. We destroy the factory. And then we execute Tony Stark." "And the Hulk?" Natasha asked. "If he stands in our way," Roger said, looking at the iron blade in his hand. "We kill him too." The choice was made. The Avengers were no longer heroes. They were an assassination squad. And high in the dark tower, Tony Stark watched the smoke rise on his internal monitors and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The chaotic variables were being removed. The equation was balancing. But Stark had made a mistake. In his arrogance, he had ignored the one variable that neither science nor sorcery could quantify. He had forgotten the ring. Frodo and Sam were still out there, and they had just watched a mountain blow up a refuge. They were terrified, cowering in a ditch mere miles from where the Avengers stood, and they had seen the captain of the West pick up a Morgul blade. The corruption was absolute. The stage was set for the final convergence. The heroes were falling, one by one, into the shadow they had come to fight. The only hope left lay in the fact that the two universes were about to reject each other with catastrophic violence. The breach was not closed. It was widening. Reality itself was beginning to tear. The sky turning the color of a bruised plum, the laws of physics unraveling, and Captain America leading a death march towards the fires of Mount Doom. The plateau of Gorgoroth was no longer a wasteland of dormant ash and silent stone. It had become a thrumming circuit board of industrial malice, a sprawl of blackened iron pipes and geothermal vents that bled the heat of the earth into the engines of a new world order. The road to Mount Doom was paved with plates of fused obsidian, smooth and unnatural, flanked by pylons that crackled with the red electricity of the corrupted Stark tech. There was no day or night here, only the rhythmic strobe of the blast furnaces and the unblinking gaze of the eye, which was now amplified by a lattice of focusing lenses orbiting the pinnacle of Barad-dûr. The Avengers moved through this nightmare not as a team, but as a jagged shrapnel of their former selves, tearing through the infrastructure of the enemy with a silence that was more terrifying than their battle cries had ever been. Captain Rogers walked at the point of the spear, his gait uneven, the weight of the crude orc scimitar in his right hand throwing off the balance honed by decades of fighting with a shield. He did not look like a symbol of liberty. He looked like a wraith of vengeance, his uniform stained with the black blood of the patrols they had butchered in the foothills. Beside him, Thor Odinson marched with the heaviness of a man walking to his own execution. Mjolnir trailing sparks along the ground, the hammer feeling less like a weapon and more like an anchor dragging him down. Natasha Romanoff guided Clint Barton, whose bandaged eyes wept continuously, his other senses overwhelmed by the acoustic torture of the machinery around them. They were not saving the world. They were entering the slaughterhouse to kill the butcher, even if the butcher wore the face of their friend. The approach to the Samath Nar was guarded not by trolls or simple orcs, but by the culmination of Tony Stark's descent into madness. Standing in formation before the entrance to the cracks of doom were the Iron Legionnaires of Mordor. These were not suits piloted by men. They were automatons, empty shells of Uruk-hai armor, animated by repulsive repulsor cores and the bound spirits of lesser wraiths. They stood 10 feet tall, their pauldrons spiked, their chest pieces glowing with the sickly orange light of the volcanic tap. As the Avengers broke the ridgeline, the Legionnaires activated in unison, a sound like 100 heavy doors slamming shut at once. They did not speak. They simply leveled their weapon arms, cannons forged from the iron of the earth and the sorcery of the Dark Tower, and opened fire. The air disintegrated. The volley was a wall of concussive force and searing heat. Rogers did not raise his shield to deflect. He dove forward, rolling under the barrage with a desperation that scrapped the skin from his elbows. He came up inside the guard of the nearest machine, swinging the orc blade with a two-handed guttural roar. The iron bit into the hydraulic cables of the Legionnaire's leg, severing the fluid lines. Black oil and steam sprayed out, hissing on the hot ground. The machine toppled, and Rogers was on it, stabbing the blade into the glowing optical sensor until the light died. It was brutal, inefficient work, a far cry from the clean, geometric combat of his past. He was brawling in the mud of history. Thor took to the sky, or what little sky was left beneath the smog. He summoned the storm, but the clouds here were thick with sulfur and resistant to his call. He had to reach deeper, past the atmosphere, connecting to the static charge of the dry ash itself. He became a lightning rod, drawing the ambient misery of Mordor into Mjolnir. He slammed the hammer down, not on a foe, but on the paved road itself. The shockwave shattered the obsidian plating, sending jagged shards flying like shrapnel. The legionnaires, balanced on the artificial surface, stumbled. Thor capitalized, hurling the hammer through the chest of the lead automaton. The impact crumpled the thick iron like tin, the magical core detonating in a violet flash that vaporized the machine and two others behind it. But there were dozens more. They adjusted their aim, their targeting algorithms learning, adapting. They were networked. Stark was watching. Inside the mountain of fire, the heat was absolute. It was not just temperature, it was pressure. The chambers of fire had been transformed. The precipice where the ring was forged was now surrounded by a suspended catwalk of titanium and glass. Massive coolant pipes pumped liquid nitrogen, synthesized from the very air of the mountains, into the magma below, cooling it just enough to be harvested. In the center, suspended over the lava by magnetic fields, was a ring-shaped particle accelerator, a device designed to smash the metaphysical atoms of magic into usable quantum energy. And at the control console, fused into the interface chair, was Tony Stark. He looked less like a man and more like a circuit that had overgrown its substrate. His armor was gone, replaced by a mesh of wires and tubes that ran directly into his flesh, pumping fluids that glowed with the same light as the eye. His skin was pale, almost translucent, revealing the dark veins of the corruption spreading from the arc reactor. The reactor itself was blinding, a miniature sun that pulsed in sync with the mountain's tremors. He watched the screens, his eyes darting across data streams that showed the battle outside. He felt no fear, only a clinical annoyance at the interruption. The calculation was 98% complete. He just needed the catalyst. "Sir," Jarvis's voice echoed in the chamber, but it was distorted, layered with the hiss of the black speech. "The intruders have breached the perimeter. Threat level, Omega. Shall I deploy the reserves?" "No," Stark said, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "Let them come. They need to see. They need to understand the architecture of peace." Outside, the battle had devolved into a meat grinder. Natasha and Clint were pinned down behind the wreckage of a drilling rig. Clint, blind and armed only with knives, was acting as a human sonar. "3 on the left flank," he shouted, his head cocked. "Hydraulic cycling. They're charging up." Natasha moved before the blast came, dragging Clint to the right. The rig exploded, showering them with hot metal. She fired her pistols, the bullets sparking uselessly against the heavy plating of the legionnaires. They were outmatched. They were going to die here, on a nameless rock, killed by the inventions of their ally. Then the ground shook, not a tremor, but a footstep, from the shadows of the high pass where the road wound down from Cirithungol. A shape emerged. It was not an army. It was a singular event. The Hulk had arrived, but he was no longer green. The soot of Mordor, the dried blood of trolls, and the overwhelming intake of dark magic had turned his skin a deep slate grey. He was larger than before, his muscles corded and unnatural, bone spurs protruding from his shoulders and elbows. He did not roar. He did not run. He walked with a terrifying purpose, ignoring the fire of the legionnaires. A repulsor blast struck him in the chest, burning the flesh. The grey Hulk didn't even blink. He continued forward, reaching the first machine. He didn't punch it. He grabbed it by the waist and the head, and with a wet, tearing sound, he ripped it in half. The brutality froze the battlefield for a heartbeat. The Hulk threw the wreckage at the remaining line, the force of the throw shattering 3 more units. He looked at Thor, his eyes burning with a red, intelligent luminescence. "Tiny God," the Hulk rumbled, his voice like rocks tumbling in a cavern. "You break the floor. I break the toys." Thor nodded, a grim acknowledgement of the monster they had let loose. "Break them all," Thor commanded. With the Hulk acting as a battering ram, the Avengers pushed forward. They breached the great iron doors of the Samatnar, the heat washing over them like a physical blow. They stumbled onto the catwalk, gasping for air, their lungs burning. And there they saw him, the architect of Mordor. Stark spun his chair around. He looked at his former friends with a look of pity. "Steve," he said, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "You look terrible. No discipline, no uniformity." "Tony," Rogers gasped, stepping forward, the orc sword dripping in his hand. "Shut it down. Whatever this is, it's over." "Over?" Stark laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "We haven't even started. Look at this, Steve." He gestured to the particle accelerator. "I've solved it. The scarcity problem. The war problem. Magic is just energy, chaotic and unrefined. I've built a refinery. We can power the Earth for 1,000,000 years. We can build a shield that Thanos can't crack. We just need to stabilize the core." "You're killing this world to do it," Natasha said, leveling her empty pistols at him. A reflex she couldn't break. "This world is already dead," Stark snapped, his face contorted with sudden anger. "It's a corpse rotting in the sun. Orcs, elves, men. They're just biological glitches fighting over scraps. I'm bringing order. I'm the only one thinking big enough to save us." "You're not saving us," Thor said, stepping onto the bridge, the lightning crackling around his fists. "You are serving the shadow. The eye watches you, Stark. It laughs at you." "I control the eye," Stark screamed, standing up, the wires tearing from his back with a spray of fluids. "I am the interface. I am the ironmonger of this age, and I will not let you regress us back to the Dark Ages." Stark raised his hands. The facility responded. Turrets dropped from the ceiling. Magnetic clamps seized the catwalk, shaking it. The fight was on. It was a tragedy of physics. Stark flew without a suit, levitated by the magnetic field generators embedded in his flesh. He fired blasts of pure thermal energy from his hands. Rogers blocked with his shield, but the heat was so intense the vibranium began to glow red hot, searing his arm. He dropped the shield with a cry of pain, forced to rely on the sword. Thor threw Mjolnir, but Stark caught it, not with his hand, but with a gravity beam that suspended the hammer in mid-air. "I analyzed the enchantment, Thor," Stark sneered. "It's just a fixed point in space-time locked to a specific biometric signature. I can override it." He flung the hammer back at Thor, striking the god in the chest and sending him flying into the wall. The Hulk charged. Stark didn't fight him physically. He activated the sonic dampeners. Huge dishes focused a frequency of sound on the Hulk that disrupted his inner ear and scrambled his neural pathways. The grey Hulk fell to his knees, clutching his head, roaring in agony as his brain vibrated inside his skull. Stark was winning. He was the environment. He was the machine. But in the chaos, amidst the noise and the fire, No one noticed two small figures crawling along the edge of the precipice, hidden by the steam. Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee had entered the chamber. They were not warriors. They were exhausted, starving, and broken. Frodo clutched the ring to his chest, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond death. He saw the machine. He saw the man of iron. And the ring saw them too. The ring began to heat up. It was not responding to Sauron. It was responding to the arc reactor. It felt a rival singularity, a rival power that sought to dominate, to order, to control. The ring was pure will. The reactor was pure logic. They were oil and water, matter and antimatter. Stark paused. His senses picked up the anomaly. He looked down. He saw the hobbit. He saw the gold band. His eyes widened. The calculation completed in his mind. The catalyst. Bring it to me, Stark whispered. He ignored the Avengers. He floated down towards Frodo. The variable. The missing piece. Give it to me, little one. I can fix it. I can unmake the flaw. No, Sam yelled, throwing a rock at the metal man. It bounced harmlessly off Stark's energy shield. Frodo stood up. He was trembling. The ring was screaming in his mind. A voice that was not Sauron's but his own, amplified to infinite cruelty. Put it on. Rule him. Make the machine kneel. Tony, don't, Roger screamed, sprinting across the catwalk, ignoring the pain in his arm. Stark reached out his hand. I just want to perfect it, he pleaded. And for a moment, the old Tony was there, the man who just wanted to build a suit of armor around the world. Please, let me fix this. Frodo looked at Stark. He looked at the ring, and he succumbed, not to the desire to destroy it, but to the desire to save it from the machine. He couldn't let the metal man have it. The ring was his. Frodo put the ring on. The reaction was instantaneous, but he did not vanish. In this chamber, saturated with Stark's dimensional tampering and the heavy magic of the earth, the invisibility failed. Instead, Frodo became a conduit. A pillar of shadow erupted from the hobbit, piercing the roof of the cavern, blasting into the sky. The eye of Sauron snapped towards the mountain. The connection was made. Stark screamed. The arc reactor in his chest resonated with the ring. A feedback loop opened. The energy of the ring, the essence of a fallen angel, flowed into Stark's technology. It didn't power it. It corrupted it instantly. The metal of the facility began to twist, to grow teeth and eyes. The catwalk groaned and turned into bone. The particle accelerator morphed into a gaping maw. System failure, Stark shrieked, clawing at his chest. Incompatible. Logic error. It's irrational. The ring was not data. It was sin. And you cannot digitize sin. The Grey Hulk, released from the sonic trap as the systems failed, looked at the chaos. He saw the world ending. He saw the only way out. He looked at Stark, who was now being consumed by his own machine, his flesh fusing with the living metal of the platform. Hulk! Smash! The monster whispered. Hulk leapt. He didn't aim for Stark. He aimed for the foundations of the catwalk. He slammed his fists into the supports with a force that cracked the heart of the mountain. The structure gave way. Stark fell. He flailed, his thrusters sputtering, the ring energy dragging him down like a gravity well. He looked up at Rogers, his eyes clearing for 1 second. The red light faded, leaving only brown eyes filled with sudden, terrible clarity. Steve, Stark whispered. We lost. Stark fell into the magma, but he didn't burn. The arc reactor, critical and overloaded with the ring's power, met the lava. The explosion was not chemical. It was metaphysical. The mountain did not just erupt, it shattered. The top of Mount Doom was blown off in a column of white fire and black shadow. The shockwave flattened the Iron Legion instantly. It swept across Gorgoroth, knocking the Barad-dûr from its foundations. The Eye shrieked, a sound of cosmic fear, as its tether to the world was severed by the sheer violence of the event. Inside the crumbling chamber, the Avengers were falling. The floor was gone. They were sliding into the fire. "Thor!" Rogers yelled, grabbing Natasha and Clint. Thor was already moving. He swung Mjolnir with every ounce of strength he had left, not to fly, but to create a vortex. He spun the hammer, creating a tornado of upward draft, catching his teammates, catching the hobbits. The wind buffeted them, burning them with ash, but it lifted them. They were thrown out of the cone of the volcano, riding the shockwave of the eruption. They crashed onto the side of the mountain, rolling down the slope of razor slag. They tumbled for what felt like miles, battered, broken, until they came to rest in a gully of grey dust. They lay there in silence as the world ended above them. The sky turned a violent, bruised purple. The Barad-dûr collapsed, its iron towers melting like wax. The ground heaved as the tectonic plates of Mordor shifted, closing the pits, burying the factories. Rogers dragged himself up. He looked at the mountain. It was gone, replaced by a crater that glowed with a soft blue radiation. Cherenkov radiation mixed with starlight. "Tony," Natasha asked, her voice a croak. Rogers shook his head. "He's gone." Thor sat up, holding his ribs. He looked at the crater. "He took the ring with him," the god said. "He destroyed it, but he did not cast it in. He consumed it. And it consumed him," Clint added, touching his bandages. "I felt it die. It was screaming his name." The grey Hulk sat apart from them, staring at the destruction. He picked up a rock and crushed it to powder. He seemed diminished, the rage burnt out by the magnitude of the explosion. He was shrinking, the grey fading back to a sickly green, then to the pale flesh of a man. Bruce Banner lay naked in the ash, weeping, and nearby, Frodo and Sam lay huddled together. Frodo was missing a finger, not bitten off, but burned off. The ring had been torn from him by the magnetic pull of the reactor. He was free, but he was hollowed out. He looked at Rogers with eyes that had seen too much. "The Shire," Frodo whispered. "Will it be there?" Rogers didn't answer. He looked at the horizon. The clouds were breaking. The sun was coming through, but it wasn't the clean sun of a fantasy world. It was a harsh, white light. The air tasted of ozone and metal. The eagles came then, but they were wary. They circled high, afraid of the radiation, afraid of the strange beings on the ground. They eventually descended, wind buffeting the survivors. They were lifted from the ruin. As they flew over the plains of Gorgoroth, they saw the cost of victory. The orc armies were scattering, leaderless, but the land was ruined. The oil slicks, the shattered machinery, the scars of industry. They would remain for 1,000 years. The magic was fading from the world, driven out not by the passing of the age, but by the trauma of the collision. They were taken to Minas Tirith. The battle there had ended when the tower fell. The Iron Dragons had shut down, their link to the central processor severed. The men of the West had won, but they looked at their saviors with fear. Aragorn met them at the gates. He looked older, harder. He saw the Avengers, bloody, dirty, carrying the weight of a friend who had become a monster. He saw the grief in Captain America's eyes. "The shadow is past," Aragorn said, but it was a question. "The shadow is changed," Rogers replied. He unstrapped the shield from his back. It was scorched black, the paint burned away, leaving only the raw vibranium. "We broke the wheel, King Alessa, but I think we broke the axle too." Thor looked up at the sky. The tear in reality, the wormhole that had brought them here, was flickering. The energy release from the reactor had destabilized the local space-time. "The way is open," Thor said softly. "The Bifrost energy. The explosion created a bridge. We can go home." "Home," Banner whispered, wrapped in a cloak. "To a cell. To a reckoning," Natasha said. They did not stay for the celebrations. They did not attend the coronation. They were not heroes of this age. They were an infection that had been cauterized. They gathered at the coordinates of the breach, in the center of the Belena fields, where the reality was thin. As the energy gathered to take them, Rogers looked back one last time. He saw Sam helping Frodo. He saw the white tree standing amidst the rubble of the siege. It was blooming, but the flowers were not white. They were grey, streaked with iron. The world had survived, but it had lost its innocence. The fourth age would not be the age of men. It would be the age of industry, built on the scraps of Stark's blueprints that survived the fall. The Avengers were leaving, but their ghost would haunt Middle-earth forever. "Avengers," Rogers whispered, the command tasting like ash in his mouth. "Disassemble." The light took them. They vanished from Arda, leaving behind a silence that was not peace, but the quiet of a graveyard after the mourners have gone home. And deep in the magma of the ruined mountain, encased in cooling rock, a single arc reactor flickered once, twice, and then died, buried alongside the melted gold of a ring that had finally found a master it could not corrupt, only destroy. The timeline was closed. The history was written, and it was a tragedy. The Fourth Age did not begin with the song of silver trumpets, but with the dull grinding of gears. In the centuries that followed the Great Vanishing, the scribes of Gondor ceased to write in the flowing script of the Quenya, and began to catalogue the world in the sharp, angular notations of the new arithmetic. The ring was gone, unmade in the cataclysm of the engineer's fall, but the shadow it cast had been replaced by a stain of oil and isotope that would not wash from the soil of Gorgoroth. The plains where the Black Tower once stood remained a dead zone, a geographic scar where the air hummed with a sickness that blistered the skin and maddened the mind. Yet brave and foolish men went there, drawn not by the will of a Dark Lord, but by the greed for the star metal. The fragments of heat-fused titanium and circuitry that littered the crater. These scavengers brought back wonders that terrified the wise. Glowing glass that could hold light without fire, and prosthetics of iron that moved with the memory of flesh. King Elessar ruled a realm that was stronger, harder, and colder than the prophecies had foretold. The walls of Minas Tirith were repaired not with white stone, but with reinforced concrete, a recipe recovered from the burned archives of the Iron Tower. The forges of the city did not rest, churning out steel of a quality that rivaled the dwarves, but lacked their soul. The elves, sensing the shift in the fundamental frequency of the matter of Arda, departed the Grey Havens in a haste that resembled flight. They whispered that the song of the earth had been drowned out by a static hiss, a ghost sound left behind by the visitors who had fallen from the sky. To the elves, the Avengers were not heroes. They were the discordant note that shattered the symphony of Iluvatar. The magic of the world did not fade gently. It was choked out by the efficiency of the machine. In the folklore of the West, the six figures became a pantheon of cautionary gods, worshipped and feared in the dark corners of taverns. There was the soldier of the broken shield, who taught that duty is a heavy blade that cuts the wielder. The green behemoth, the patron spirit of earthquakes and uncontrollable rage, to whom farmers sacrificed oxen to spare their homes. The thundercaller, whose name was invoked to ward off storms but never to welcome them. And the Iron Demon, the tragic architect who sought to build heaven and dug a pit to hell. Mothers in the vales of Anduin would warn their children not to seek knowledge beyond their station, lest they wake the burning heart of the machine. The final artifact of the crossover lies deep within the vaults of the citadel, guarded by the silent descendants of the stewards who allow no light to touch it. It is not a sword nor a ring. It is a faceplate of red and gold alloy, scorched and twisted, its electronic eyes dark and dead. It sits upon a pedestal of black marble, an enigma that defies the smiths of the world. Sometimes, when the storms roll in from the east and the lightning strikes the high conductors of the modernizing city, the faceplate flickers with a ghostly blue light, and for a microsecond, a voice speaks from the metal, repeating a final looped command that no scholar can translate, a prayer from a lost timeline. System reboot. But the system never reboots. The world moved on, scarred, advanced, and irrevocably changed.